This is talk 2 for Roadblocks to Republic, and today is Sheas Rebellion, which is going back to what we were discussing earlier. This is, I guess, an incident that's relatively forgotten. I mean, who really talks about this? But as I mentioned, he's shaking his head. Yeah. Well, again, the locale here makes a difference, I guess. Because that came up, going back to what you're just intimating, that came up when last year they were, the Texas Board of Education, when they were redoing the curriculum, and they wanted to make sure that something like the Alamo is left in, which we're not going to teach that here. So, the locale does make a difference here. Interesting. Yet this is the same meeting where they were going to take Helen Keller out of the curriculum. Because she's a socialist, that's probably one reason. Yes. The Sheas Rebellion. This is an interesting episode here because this is one of those which I like to highlight here as, when leading even up to the Battle of Yorktown, things weren't all that rosy here. They really weren't. I mean, the Americans are going to win the American Revolution, but at what cost here, or at what threat to what's going to be a republic, which is why, I call this Roadblocks to Republic. Even Benedict Arnold, interestingly enough, saw that by 1778, 1779, 1780, maybe this isn't going to survive. Maybe this revolt is going to fall apart. He saw that the currency here was you could wallpaper the walls with it. People were going hungry. The army, many of the soldiers are wearing rags. They're not getting paid. They're not getting the food on time. Where is this really going to go here? Maybe I ought to change sides again. I mention again because, when he's born in 1741, we're not a country. He's born as a British subject. And then he turns on them to become an ardent colonist, rebellion, rebel. And then, when this doesn't look like it's going to work, he turns on the rebels and rejoins the British. So he's a traitor twice, really, if you think about it. If you really think about it. But the fact of the matter is, that's what he thought he saw. He's not totally incorrect here. If you think about it, put yourself in that time. And so when you begin to see these revolts in the Continental Army in 1780, out to March 15, 1783, the officers, the problem with the officers, and that's interesting from the perspective, when you have the soldiers, the privates, the corporals, and the sergeants who are restive because they're not getting paid, they're not getting the uniforms they were promised, and they're not getting the food they were promised. That can be construed as, from a military point of view, as a job action. Maybe if you solve those problems, you'll solve the problem with the privates, the corporals, and the sergeants. But maybe not so with the officers, because many of these guys thought, gee whiz, we're forming a new country here. That means an army. I've got job security, right? No, the officer class. The officer class, though, is different from the privates, the corporals, and the sergeants. The officer class becomes a class in society that's important. Do they become a determining class? Could be. All you got to do is look at the free officers movement and look at Egypt. How did that work out? The army runs the country, even to the point where they run the economy. They're into business, like the Revolutionary Guard in Iran. Look at Hitler's SS. Who do you think ran the concentration camp system? The SS did. Even to having the Waffen-SS, the armed SS. And so that can be a danger. That can be a threat. And Washington puts this down in the end, but then still, the economy isn't great. It's not great at all. And so, when you take a look at what's going on in places like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Rhode Island even tries to legislate allegiance to its currency. Get a load of that one. Get a load of, and I'll get into that a little bit as we go on. But then again, in this handout, I was struck by what Jefferson states here. When he writes about this in November 1787. Yet where does this anarchy exist? Where did it ever exist except in the single instance in Massachusetts? And can history produce an instance of a rebellion so honorable conducted? Get a load of that line. So honorable conducted. I say nothing of its motives. They were founded in ignorance. Get a load of that line. They were founded in ignorance, not wickedness. Is he kind of throwing a sop to these people here? You know he is. You know he is. God forbid, now get a load of this line. God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. Is it normal and is it healthy for people to call their governance into question? Is that what he's saying here? The people cannot be all and always well informed. And now we're beginning to sound a little like Hamilton here. Don't trust the common man because they don't know enough to govern? Is that what he's saying here? The part which is wrong will be discontented in proportion to the importance of the facts they misconceive. The facts they misconceive. If they remain quiet under such misconceptions, it is a lethargy, the forerunner of death to the public liberty. He's also saying it's okay for people to go to the streets. It shows they're not lazy, that maybe they have some cognizance of what's going on. Okay, if your elected officials aren't solving your problems, where do you go? The streets. You know, the pavement parliament here. Or she didn't have paved roads back then, perhaps. We have had 13 states, independent 11 years. There has been one rebellion. Interesting, his math here. If that comes to one rebellion in a century and a half for each state. What country before ever existed a century and a half without a rebellion? And as I darken this one, what country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take up arms. The remedy is to set them right as to facts, pardon, and pacify them. What signify a few lives lost in a century or two, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. What an analysis here by Jefferson. And I make my own. Jefferson seems to understand the grievances of those seeking to take up arms to enforce their objectives here. He seems to understand this. Of course, isn't he a revolutionary? Although let's understand the time here too. This quote comes from November 13, 1787. You know, Sheas Rebellion goes back to August 1786 to February 1787. And so is he throwing an additional sop to these people? Yeah, sure, you have the right to grievance. You have the right. You have the right to go into the streets. However, is he one who seems to be thinking compromise here? You know, that word that some people say doesn't exist anymore in our politics. Yeah, you know, let's understand the people instead of just calling out the organs of security and gunning them. Because what does that do? Hardens the positions. Yes. And interesting as you go along here, and I purposely chose it to be the last quote, George Washington. Washington is another one here. You know, and I mentioned this before. You know, okay, he was a landowner, a big one. Did he want more land? Of course he did. Was he a slave owner? Of course he was. But this country is blessed from the perspective he was not another Oliver Cromwell. He won't be a Napoleon, and he wasn't a Julius Caesar. And the guy didn't even want to be president. No, you got to stick around. You wanted to go home after the first term. No, you got to stick around. Finally, I'm leaving. I'm out of here. And without a law, he kind of sets the pattern of the two-term president. That's strong here. That really is. That really is. It's fascinating to see here. But then again, I mean, this notion that Jefferson, for God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. Again, he understands the people's right to dissent. That's healthy. Jefferson did not believe, and although Jefferson did not believe, though, that the masses can always be informed, they misconceive facts, depending, of course, on what are believed to be facts. Right? Your economy stinks because of immigrants. No, it doesn't. Geez, I mean, are you that deaf, dumb, and stupid here? I mean, the economy stinks because it's not well run. It's been arranged for the few, whatever the case may be there. Just because of immigrants? You got to be kidding me. Again, you go back to I think it's the Census Department, Commerce and Census Department, and take a look. There's a chart here that shows the immigration, like from the 1820, 1825 up to the mid-1970s. And as that goes up, where was the American economy going? With it. Goes with it. Why? Because we were expansion central, especially as we industrialized. We didn't produce enough people to fill those factories. Guess who's going to fill those factories? Immigrants. Well, you remember Irish and Germans, Italians, so on and so forth, right? Yeah. And then after the mid-70s, the American economy leveled off. But it's fascinating here. So immigrants were a boon here at one point. But that doesn't mean, again, facts. That helps, facts. And yet, if they remain quiet under such misconception of facts, the result is lethargy. It is. If people really are not enamored with finding the truth, what happens to real representative government here? That's a death knell. When you accept, what is it Hitler said in Mein Kampf? When the same lie is told over and over and over, and well, you would know that. You lived in that era. Yeah. There. What is it? That's fact, right? It's fact. And yet we get the counter here, false news, or false journalism, false news, right? He also notes that it is the imperative of the malcontents to be apprised of the facts. That's what he's intimating here. There's a reason that your economic situation the way it is. Well, let's find out what the facts are. Too many people being foreclosed on, too many people, losing their jobs perhaps, rising prices, rising interest rates. I can't afford to maintain the mortgage on this place. Well, what can we do to solve that problem? No. Well, a lot of it is the gift of gab, trading information verbally. There's the printed word. You attended meetings, this kind of thing. And of course, back then, you're talking about a country, meaning which is fledgling at this point, the United States. It seems like, for public office, elected office, the office, the man didn't go for the office seemed like it was searching for the man. And although, and I mentioned this last week, I think one of the greatest mistakes that the founders ever made, although, again, check that, I mentioned last week too, that letter by Thomas Jefferson to Samuel Kercheval, where he said every 19 or 20 years there should be a constitutional convention, and that should be in the Constitution. Where every generation acclimates our founding documents to that generation. Because because as the country, the society, the economy, and political structure moves on, the document has been sedentary. Because as Jefferson says in that same letter, the country belongs to the living and not the dead. Well, he understood that the country in 1787 is not going to be the same country in 1857. And yet, at the same time here, my criticism, and they're not going to be perfect, you know that. My criticism here is that when the founders put this together, the checks and balances, to me there was one check and balance left out. That there is no mechanism in that Constitution to apprise or organize or put together that mechanism. How do we nominate people to federal office? Keep in mind, there weren't parties when they're putting this together. How do we nominate people to federal office? Since that was left out, who now chooses who gets nominated to federal office? Parties. Now, do you think some of these people in these parties are looking after the best interests of the country? I will say no. Proof's been in the pudding here. Yes. No, there's a case in point that can be made, but at the same time here, sitting down and actually having a bona fide constitutional convention, how would that be now? Well, term limits are interesting from the perspective, I believe that maybe a senator should have 2 6-year terms, he's out, and maybe a representative have 4 2-year terms, he's out. He or she is out. And we go from there. Because today the person seeks the office, it's not the office seeking the person anymore, really. And then you get to the thing about money. And so, but the problem here is when you go back to this thing, the economy here really wasn't all that strong. And some economies, some of these, and keep in mind another aspect here. There's still that autonomous attitude here among these various colonies becoming states. Go back to what I mentioned last week. When you look at the founding nature of this country, these colonies, 13 colonies, back in the 1750s, 1760s, what did somebody in South Carolina have in common with somebody in Massachusetts? Why? Because they dug in the dirt, they're farmers? Now, okay, that's a commonality. Most people were farmers. Most people were farmers. But otherwise, what do they have in common? The social mores might be somewhat different. The courtesies might be somewhat different. Those types of things, societal differences. But at the same time here, they are jealously trying to guard their autonomy here. But what puts it all together? They all seem to agree here. Well, many seem to, not all. Remember what John Adams stated at the beginning of the American Revolution. 1/3 of the colonists were blue, probably meaning true blue. 1/3 were Tories. The other third were timid. So not everybody is on board here. And so what are the blue and the timid, blue and the Tories trying to do? Push the timid off the fence onto their side of the land. They're trying to do that. But so not everybody is on board here. However, when you have something like, and you begin to get these spontaneous uprisings, you can't win a revolution with spontaneous uprisings. The closest to me that I can recall that comes to success here are the Afghans, because they're so screwed up. They seem to bury their differences long enough, all these tribes and clans and so on and so forth. They all seem to come in ethnicities here. I mean, take a look at a map of an ethnic makeup of Afghanistan. Throw a dart at the board and you pick a loser. You really do here. But they come together just enough to throw you out, and then they're back to squabbling again. But to have has this ever really been a functioning state? Not really. I mean, the president in Kabul is really the mayor of Kabul. Here, though, you had all these spontaneous uprisings, but enough of who are going to be the founders were intelligent enough to get this right with the Declaration of Independence. That's a unifier. It's more than a declaration. It's a unifier, because now you got 56 signers from 13 colonies signing this. Now you have somewhat of a unified effort here to throw out the common enemy, George III. Then after that, now we're going to have to try to overcome the autonomous nature of these colonies to form a country here. But when the economy is not that great, I mean, keep in mind, what's backing the currency here? Air? Air, yeah. Yes. And some of these town meetings were, when you go back prior to the revolution, some of these town meetings are based on see spontaneous uprisings. When you're pushing out the Crown-appointed administrator, that the people in that town meeting now have to be effectively the political leaders. But that's local. That's not national. Right. But interestingly enough, when you have these spontaneous uprisings to push out Crown-appointed administrators, they effectively become the rulers here in committee, really, of the area they're in, the little town, the little village, township, whatever the case may be. But you can't win a revolution with spontaneous uprisings. Somebody has to knit them. Somebody has to organize this. And here it's going to be your founders with the Declaration of Independence. They get enough people to sign on here. The other side of the coin here was happening. You can make the case, historical parallel here with Petrograd in 1917. These spontaneous uprisings to push out Tsar-appointed administrators. I mean, you had people taking control of a city block in Petrograd. Workers, soldiers, peasants, and they're forming Soviets. Soviets are committees. And this spreads to the outlying districts with the peasants. But somebody's got to knit this. And who's going to come along and knit this? Lenin. And so interesting here how you see what developed here develops in other countries, and maybe there's a commonality to learn these lessons here. But here, even during the American Revolution, when they were printing their own money, these colonies are printing their own money, and the army is relying here on the beneficence of these colonies. Where's that money going to come from? We're going to pay you. Where's that money going to come from? And then when it's over, the currency is still based on air. How are you going to grow your economy here? And that's what's going to happen here in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, and all through these colonies. Somebody had a hand up. Yes? But then some colonies knew how to operate here. Some colonies, in fact, I have a listing here. Some of them, a short listing here. There were colonies able to maneuver their way out of their financial difficulties. South Carolina, Pennsylvania, and New York seem to have an idea on what to do here. Georgia, their currency declined by 75% in value. North Carolina and New Jersey were depressed. Rhode Island attempted to legislate loyalty to their currency. Now, I don't think I have to tell you how far that went with some people, especially lenders. You're telling me I have to be loyal to your currency? Lenders start to leave. In fact, interestingly enough here with Rhode Island, citizens could obtain a loan for 14 years, and you could use your land as collateral. And yet, some of the lenders are leaving. So how are you going to borrow if you need a loan if the lenders are leaving? How's that going to work out? And so interestingly enough, the state urged debtors to seek help from a judge. The Rhode Island Supreme Court in Trent versus Whedon decision declared that it was unconstitutional for the state to fine the creditors for refusing the currency. This was followed by the coercive legislation from being revoked, after which, where do you think the currency went further? Down. And so Rhode Island was a basket case. Yes? Well, New York and Pennsylvania will be, by comparison, will be fairly well populated by comparison to something like Rhode Island. The other side of the coin here is some of these colonies knew how much money to print. In other words, if your economic interaction is viable, well, maybe we need some more money. If you're getting a slowdown, you cut back on the money supply. Some of these colonies / states will raise taxes to take some of the money out of circulation. Some had to do that. But in places like Massachusetts, you are now seeing a rise in foreclosures because people can't pay the taxes. In fact, I have it noted here too. Where was it here? Yeah, between In Massachusetts, the legislature was determined to free the colony of debt and shore up the currency. Between 1780 and 1786, 1.9 million pounds in taxes were levied. 1.9 million, not 1.9 million. That sounds like chump change today. That's not then. That's not then. And many of those who bore the brunt of these taxes were those of moderate income. And so interesting here too, you know, by the time this rolls around, 1786, a farmer is paying 1/3 of what he's making in taxes. How do you think you're going to survive? If you have a farm, don't you have to sometimes buy feed and so on and so forth, equipment for your farm, right? And so if you're in this situation, how much do you have to charge to sell your crops or whatever it is you're growing or whatever it is you're supplying here? Is this an issue? Yeah, and when some people are foreclosed on, what happens to them if they can't pay the debt? Jail? Debtor's prison? Could be. Could be. Could be. That's a problem. That's not what we fought for by 1781. That's not what we fought for. Interesting the mindset that's developing here. Keep in mind, this is just prior, this is leading up to the Constitutional Convention. And so in 1786, people like Daniel Shays, who was a Revolutionary War vet, you know, they're going to descend on Springfield, and you know, there's a federal court there. And interestingly enough, you know, many of these people think they're going to get arrested perhaps, and so some of them go armed to the courthouse. To the courthouse. And at one point, the court proceedings were adjourned. That happened in other states, you know, where people show up armed, and the employees here adjourn the proceedings because they were afraid of a backlash here, a problem here. And so what people did with the revolution by arming themselves are some people beginning to do here after the revolution, because the revolution isn't underscoring that promise they thought they were signing on to with revolution. Could this lead to a counter-revolution? Keep in mind, some of the people involved in this round of unpleasantness had also been in the Revolutionary Army. That's a problem. They're trained. That's a problem. They're trained here. It's fascinating, the situation that's developing here in Massachusetts. Yet, did this really happen in any other colonies or states? Not to this extent. Yeah. To tell you the truth, when my wife and I go to Lake George, I always drive up Route 7, and I never take the highways. You know, my kids will say, "Why don't you take the highways? It's quicker. If I want to look at concrete and steel, I'll come home." And I like going up Route 7, and I like that drive from Sheffield to the Vermont border. I like that drive, and I like that end of the Massachusetts more than I like the other side. Yeah, yeah, and so I always was enamored with that side of Massachusetts. I mean, the topography is beautiful. That's one thing I liked, but you're right. It's the western end of Massachusetts where this is really going to take place, not really the eastern end. But you're right. The red-haired, freckle-faced stepchild here with regards to that state. But again, you're seeing, and again, land is a determinant for power, and that's the threat for these people. Now, again, some of these people come together here with their arms to try to win their point. And I find this interesting when you go back to 1786 to February 1787, then fast forward to the Depression. There were people, 1932, 33, 34, in the Dust Bowl. You know, some of these farmers were being foreclosed on. Here's that word again, foreclosed on. And yet some Americans who were maybe economically viable, other farmers, would grab a rifle or a pump shotgun and join the neighbor who was going to be foreclosed on the front porch, because back then the banker would come along, one of the bank employees would come along with the foreclosure paperwork, and he'd get there, he'd find 4, 5, 6 people on the front porch of the person to be foreclosed on with Winchesters or pump shotguns. You go ahead and serve that paperwork. And yet sometimes the bank would work, now the bank will work out a situation. Well, how do we extend the loan perhaps so you can pay it off? Now, having said that, is that the correct way of doing things? One would think not. But then again, my point here is, here you saw the person being foreclosed on joined by his neighbors who were concerned enough to protect the person to be foreclosed on. Is that a cohesion here? Go back to what happened in Massachusetts, then go back to the Dust Bowl more than a century down the road. I didn't hear anything like that for 2008. I didn't hear anything like that at all. What does that tell you? Maybe you got a more divided country? I'm not advocating that you should go out, you know, if the banker's going to show up with the foreclosure paperwork, you grab your Dan Wesson 44 Magnum and tell them, go ahead, serve that paperwork. The country's different today. You know, times are different here today. And I don't think you have that cohesiveness of a population like you had perhaps in the 30s and then towards the end of the 18th century. I don't think you quite have that. Yes? I beg your pardon?
You spoke prior about commonality.
Well, there is a commonality in the land here. Yeah, I think, but this is with this rebellion. I mean, when it starts, really August 29, 1786, and like he mentioned, it is going to be put down. And Shays and 11 others are going to be sentenced to death for this. He escaped to Vermont.
But at least they tried.
Well, they tried, and they made a point. They made a point because of what happened with Sheas Rebellion. I mean, I'm not going to get into the particulars of the rebellion itself as opposed to the aftershocks here. I mean, look at this. The impacts of Sheas Rebellion went beyond the borders of Massachusetts. For instance, Pennsylvania debtors put a stop to the confiscation of cattle to service debts. That's Pennsylvania. South Carolina, the farmers descended on the Camden courthouse, which caused judges to adjourn the proceedings. In Virginia, inhabitants of Caroline County band together and pledged not to buy confiscated property. Talk about unity here among some people. Again in Pennsylvania, well, this may be, well, you could say going to extremes here. Mobs torched the King William County courthouse, resulting in many of the court's records and files going up in flames. Now who owns the land? Yeah. In fact, you saw the same sort of thing here during the French Revolution, when the peasants would descend on government buildings and torch it. And what happened to the privilege set and the deeds to the property? Went up in flames. And so what was the next stop for the peasants? Let's just grab the land and divide it up. And that's exactly what they're going to do. And you saw this again in the Russian Revolution. Gee, that's terrible that the peasants did all that. You know, Lenin had the right idea. You can't stop them. How are you going to stop 90% of the population from exercising pent-up frustration for centuries? Land in Massachusetts, land in France, land in Russia. You don't see a tie here with people getting fed up? I do. I see a tie here. It happens all the time. Yeah, what is it we don't understand about this? I mean, we have a problem understanding this, perhaps. And so don't think the Constitutional Convention, don't think those participants in the Constitutional Convention didn't understand this. And yet, go back to what, when we started with Jefferson's quote here, go back to Mr. Washington here, And he wrote a letter to Henry Lee on October 31, 1786. This is during Sheas Rebellion. He says, "You talk, my good sir, of employing influence to appease the tumults in Massachusetts. I know not where that influence is to be found, and if attainable, that it would be proper to remedy the disorders. Influence is no government." Get a load of that line. Influence is no government. Let us have one, meaning a government, by which our lives, liberties, and properties will be secure. That's Washington. Or let us know the worst case at once. Under these impressions, my humble opinion is that there is a call for decision, and I darken this one, know precisely what the insurgents aim at. Sounds like Jefferson in a way. Try to understand what the grievance is. If they have and this is what he says, if they have real grievances, redress them. If possible, or acknowledge the justice of their complaints and your inability of doing it. In other words, adjusting the complaints, addressing the complaints. If they have not, if they don't have legitimate grievances, employ the force of government against them at once. Isn't that what he did in addressing some of these mutinies in the army? He had a couple shot. Is that addressing the problem? One would think. If this is not adequate, now here he said, now he calls the government into question. If this is not adequate, all will be convinced that the superstructure is bad or wants support. Which means if the government can't address the grievances, there must be something wrong with that government. Maybe the government needs to be redone. Maybe it needs to be restructured. Maybe you need a new government. Maybe you need a new government. And keep in mind, this is the revolutionary generation. And yet Hancock became governor of Shays, before Sheas Rebellion, defeated the sitting governor, James Baldwin. Many considered Baldwin a friend of the big property owners and the money class. And yet, what's Hancock going to do after Sheas Rebellion? Give him immunity. We're not going to hang him. Does that win you friends? One would think. And Hancock even didn't take his governor's salary. Of course, he didn't have to. He was one of the richest people in the country at the time, for crying out loud. But is that trying to make up for what had been going on in this state? Perhaps. Perhaps. And interesting here, the new legislation. New legislation passed relief for those who were discontented. Items such as clothing, household goods, tools, and equipment for one's livelihood were considered exempt from the debt process. If you're going to pay off your debt, don't you need your clothes? Don't you need your farm equipment? Since mostly people are farm, don't you need your farm equipment to process your whatever products you're growing so as to sell them and pay off the debt? Yeah, why would you want to put them in prison for? They're not producing anything in prison. Of course, the prisons then some of those prisons weren't operated by Corrections Corporations of America today. Yes. Correct. Although, again, another historical backdrop here, when you go back to what followed after the 30 Years' War in Europe, in which you had like 5 to 8 million people died in this war. And another offshoot of that is many of the people in line were peasants, and if you kill off a lot of your peasants, who's growing the food, who's processing the food, starvation it comes after the war. But then again, they began to sink in here that maybe we shouldn't have mass armies, conscript armies. Maybe what we ought to do here is have an army of professionals and then put people to work. Sounds like a plan to me. So what are they doing? Men who were in debtor's prison, what's the option to get out? Well, we'll absolve your debt, but guess what? Put on a uniform. Right, for 30 years, right, yeah. Yeah, yes, and then I'll move back, yes.
What you're saying,
Right. Yeah, they have that parliamentary procedure. We don't have that.
that's what I'm saying.
Right. And so once you elect somebody, you're stuck with them for 4 years, be he good or bad.
Not in England, yeah, here.
Right, here, right. Unless, of course, you want to impeach them. You know, now that's messy. We know that. But, you know, but again here, yeah, that's right. Because, and so when you look at our system when it was formed, going back to this era, yeah, you could elect your president for 4 years and your representative for 2 years. Of course, back then you didn't elect your senator; your state legislators appointed them. But then again, at the same time, your founders don't want a large standing army. Limited suffrage. There's a limited army, limited suffrage. And so, you know, it's based on the militia system. Every white male, 18 to 45, was part of the militia. The governors controlled the militia. But that's right, you had limited suffrage here. You had to be a white man and property owner. Although, as you're going to find out when I do that series next month on the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote, Massachusetts again, Uxbridge, Mass. Lydia Taft was the first woman considered a female voter in this country. In 1756. Maybe something had to do with it that she was a rich widow. I don't know. Can't answer that question. But limited suffrage. And so if you're obviously an Indian, if you're black, you're a woman, and you're a poor white with no land, you aren't voting. Yet as more people get land, does that increase the voting pool? Yeah, it does. And so when you go back to this so-called rebellion, it's really not a real concerted rebellion. It really doesn't last long. But your founders at the Constitutional Convention understood what could happen if this issue is not addressed. If this issue is not addressed. Well, you know, FDR was pragmatic enough to understand, and he told members of his class, you guys better give me some money here. Because, you know, after the Depression, and in 1933 might have been the worst year, because in 1933 when he takes office, the unemployment rate is 25%. One of every 4 American workers is on the street. And at the same time, you have a social safety net here? No, you don't. How many women, how many two-income families did you have? The economy really wasn't based on a two-income family, lifestyle. It was later on after the war, but not here. And so when Daddy was out of a job, what happened here? What happened here? And he's telling them, you know, you better give me some money to straighten this economy out, because there are competing systems here. Bolshevism, fascism, Nazism. Better half a loaf than no loaf. Well, you know, but again, Franklin D. Roosevelt, you know, sometimes technology helps make the leader. And how many were as good in front of a microphone and listening to him on the radio, right? You didn't have that back in this era, the time of Sheas Rebellion. But at the same time, though, you had, and people were reading, many people were reading then, you had people who knew how to use the English language. And if you read, you know, read what Washington says here about this rebellion here. In other words, you know, he has more of that approach of understanding why you have this situation in the first place, and let's try to address it. Although he states if their grievances aren't justified, what's the alternative? Crackdown. That's the approach he used in quelling those mutinies and rebellions in the army. That's what he used. Yet Jefferson at the same time, though, maybe a little bit more understanding. These, you know, there's nothing wrong with dissent. These aren't, well, you said safety valves. And so if you address the issues causing the need for a safety valve, then are you trying to bring people together here for unity? Yeah, you are. And then you get somebody like Hancock, who just immunity for everybody. Absolved? No, they're not. You're not going to be tried. You're not going to be shot or anything like that. And so come on back home. Wow, that's interesting. You won't face the music. You won't face the music. You know, we'll try to solve the problem. Now the question is, would you find that today? Well, back then, well, you know, let's understand something here too. You know, you're putting together. This is a new country. You don't want to tear it apart since it's new. The idea here is to put it together, because if we don't put it together, could the British come back? That has to be accounted for here. That has to be accounted for here. Now fast forward to the 1930s. You better give me some money to straighten this out. If not, there's Bolshevism, fascism, Nazism. And people could tear it apart. If the American promise fails to address these issues, these economic, and again, it's economic. Going back to it, again, economic, which leads to the political. And so today, though, today, is there that, do you have those, you have to ask the question, do you have those people in leadership positions that maybe are as pragmatic as a Jefferson, Hancock, or a Washington, or a Franklin D. Roosevelt? Now, that's a question you have to seriously chew on here. You have to seriously, and are they cognizant, and are the leaders today cognizant of what's really causing the economic downturn and why people feel the way they do? Well, you know, and of course, back in the time that, you know, the Sheas Rebellion, communications were not instantaneous. You get to the 30s, they were more instantaneous with the telephone, the microphone, and the radio. Today, take the little phone out. Yep. Or, you know, you hit on something here, because with the last presidential run, what is it Hillary said about some of the Trump supporters, deplorables? Are you writing them off? Is that what she's doing here? And she's shaking her head back there, yes. And so perhaps, you know, and I was listening to Chris Hedges one time, not all that long ago, and he said, and Bernie Sanders complained about this after he lost the nomination. He says, Hillary's running around, half the things she's saying is Trump is bad, Trump is this, Trump is that. Where's the policies? Where are the policies? He says that's what she should be talking about. As opposed to Trump, people can say whatever they want about him. He's the guy that's telling you your job has been exported. This is what we're going to do to get those jobs back. He's hitting the issues, whether you like him or not. Whether he plans on doing anything about it or not is irrelevant. You know, he was smart enough to go from the right to the left to appeal to workers and then go back to the right again. He was smart enough to do that, as opposed to Hillary, who was, deplorables. That's not going to win you votes. That's not going to win you votes. And so, interesting here, the politics on the ground. You know, Trump is trying to appeal, I know your pain, elect me. That was Hitler. Well, whether Hitler or Hillary are doing, whether Trump or Hillary are doing this, that's Hitler. And I find it interesting that when Hitler, he writes in Mein Kampf that trade unions are essential to a functioning government. Get a load of that one. And yet, at the same time, when he becomes chancellor, in January 3, 1933, on May 1, he catered to some of the union agenda's request. We want that May 1st holiday. The International Labor Day. We want that as a holiday. Yeah, okay, fine. He gave it to them. Next day, he abolished the unions. May 2, 1933, the Reich Ministry of Labor went into all the coffers of all the unions, emptied them out, took the money. Now there's only one union. Wow. Yes?
There
And yet at the same time, as you're talking, I'm thinking here, Shays rebelling against, Shays and his minions rebelling against taxes. Well, isn't that what the colonists did when the British began to assert the Tea Act, the Sugar Act, so on and so forth, right? Taxation without representation, here we go. Your point about it happening prior to us having really a government here is to be well taken, because at the same time here, the founders are, many of your founders were not fans of democracy, especially of the participatory type, and that gets you back to what you were mentioning too about parliamentary procedure, perhaps. But at the same time here, as they form this thing known as the Republic, as they call it, and they're watching what's going on. France is just down the road here, 1789. That's 3 years after Sheas Rebellion really starts. And so what's happening here? Of course, the French, there's more moving parts. We didn't have a functioning bourgeoisie, as it's generally accepted. We did not have a functioning working class. Most people are still farmers here. And so, although most people were peasants or farmers in France too, but they had more factories, so they have more of a working class. And so many of them are not really affluent, they're working class / working poor. Now you got that aspect here together with the peasants. And so interestingly enough, they watch, and this is one of the reasons it turns into abject violence compared to the American Revolution. And so when you take a look at how the founders put this together, part of this off Sheas Rebellion, and then look at what they see with the French Revolution, you see, we were right. I mean, your Constitution, again, this thing about underestimating the impact of Sheas Rebellion, take a look at your Bill of Rights. The first 11 amendments are what? Protections for you against the infringement of government. Your Constitution is your blueprint for government, but the Bill of Rights is supposed to be your protections against the infringement of government. But then when you read the following amendments that are applied later on, like the 14th, and even the 15th here, the 14th in particular, this is what Southerners see, that states, in fact, I got it right here. Why go through this? I got it right here. Interesting what Southerners began to see and to a certain extent they're right. They really are. And they're not the only ones that are going to see this. 13th Amendment here. 13th, 1865. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. They're virtually telling Southerners here, what you had prior to 1865 is over. And so Southerners are going to begin to see this, and other people will see this too, that no longer are these amendments protecting us against the infringement of government as opposed to instituting strong central government. You're telling the states what they can and cannot do. Now you can make the case here, well, indentured servitude, slavery, that's wrong. Okay, that's fine, but what solves the problem? Not the states, Washington. And they say the same thing here about the 14th. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Does that sound like something against states' rights? I mean, a states' rights purist would say so, maybe. And no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person with its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. You are seeing, since the states, maybe Washington considers the states not up to that task, somebody has to be. It's Washington. But again, the first 11 amendments seem to be protections for you against the infringement of government. Now big government. Correct. But there seems like some people are construing this as saying, well, now there seems to be a change in the flavor here. Washington is asserting its authority. Now that's an interesting discussion. But again, go back to Sheas Rebellion, and you see that the founders are influenced here at the Constitutional Convention. We better throw some bones to the people or we're going to have some more of these. And yet, after 1865, interesting what's slowly beginning to develop here. What's slowly beginning to develop here into what you have today. You know, you have these incremental steps that lead you to a result. And maybe you don't have a result because history just keeps moving on. It's fascinating to see this. Yes? Right. Well, you know, your point here, you know, the Tea Party was yeah, it starts as a grassroots, but then again, you have people like the Koch brothers involved in here. But the point here is that it was more of a right-wing agenda. But at the same time here, they're calling into question but bouncing off your point here, the Tea Party backlash, if you want to call it that. And I remember because, you know, as a Republican, I watched from the Reagan years, you know, people I used to call ultra-nationalists, racists, and people I used to characterize as of questionable religious character being admitted into the party. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have a right to be heard. If you're going to admit people, they have a right to be heard here. But every time they wanted a certain candidate to represent their interests, like a Huckabee or a Santorum, the party always had a Reagan, a Bush Sr., a Bob Dole when he ran against Clinton, you know, Bush Jr., Romney when he ran, John McCain. They're more acceptable on a wider plane. Yet, going back to after Obama got elected, and then you see the rise of the Tea Party, in 2016, it didn't work. Why? Because the Republican so-called party didn't address the agenda of the so-called malcontents. Only now it seems like, and I get the message emails from the Tea Party. I get them, and I get, you know, and I read them, and I get the messages from the left, and I read those. Interesting what you read here when you take the time to read them. But now it seems that ever since, you know, after the Tea Party was formed, you've had a rise of something even more to the right, those neo-Nazi, pseudo-fascist white supremacist groups like Daily Stormer, the Three Percenters, Patriot Front, and their membership has grown here. And so maybe what the Tea Party didn't do or didn't accomplish, these groups think they can. Only they're more proactive. Let's put it that way. In fact, Daily Stormer is in Connecticut. And, you know, I mean, and when you look at, you know, well, the Ku Klux Klan, in some respects, the Klan are choir boys. Really are. These groups are, you know, some of them swastikas and so on and so forth. Yes. Well, there is some truth to that because when you look at some of these groups, these so-called deplorables, again, you know, when you go back to what Chris Hedges was saying about Trump, highlighting why these people are in this situation. And so instead of calling them deplorables, I'm not asking you to feel sorry for the Daily Stormer here. What I am asking you to do is look at, well, why do they feel that way? Have they been ostracized from their economy? Maybe their jobs have been offshored and they, you know, oh, Christmas, look what happened here. I don't have that future my father had or my grandfather had, you know, with unionism and so on and so forth. Maybe they feel ostracized from society. You know, there are people who feel that way, and they're going to gravitate to others who feel that way, and that's the nucleus for a problem. It really is. Yeah. Ardent nationalism. Ardent nationalism. And you saw in Greece, too, the face-off with the extreme left, extreme right. You know, well, you know, it's some of this, you know, when you look at this extreme right-wingism, fascist tendencies, I mean, fascism is a draconian version of capitalism. I mean, go back to what Mussolini sold here. And I was just reading his Charter of the Worker just the other night, April 1927, where, you know, Mussolini was one of those who believed that those ideas of the Age of Reason, Age of Enlightenment led to 1914. And so the people can't be trusted to be rulers. They can't be trusted to be the government. Well, he sounds like a few of what your founders were talking about. But he took it from the perspective that, the corporation is the ultimate endeavor of a state, and so the corporation and big financial institutions run the economy, but where's the worker? That's where the worker is. And so, this corporate fascist state which is the basic definition of a fascist state, a corporate fascist state. And so when you take a look at America today, that's what America is, a corporate state. And so when people say, well, now we're fascist because of Trump, no, you've fulfilled that basic definition before Trump even got in. The big corporations and big financial institutions run the economy. So what happened to free market? Don't believe that. I mean, when banks don't want to loan or lend to small and medium-sized businesses, where are you going here? What happened to entrepreneurship? Interesting, fascinating. Well, but when you look at the Pentagon, there's a classic example of corporate socialism. 54 cents of every dollar of discretionary spending in this country goes to war and related. Who benefits from that? Lockheed, Boeing, Sikorsky, so on and so forth. Yeah, but at the same time here, Social Security is maintained by deductions from the workers, right? But that's not really considered part of the budget proper, from the perspective that you are paying with your direct taxes for war. But then again, it seems that we are borrowing for these wars. And so instead of really taxing for the wars, we're borrowing. Now, if you go to World War II, that's not how this worked. They taxed, or they sold war bonds. Remember, you see some of those older movies, buy bonds in this theater. They were even selling them in the movie theaters, for Pete's sakes. That doesn't happen anymore. And so when you're borrowing for wars and you ain't winning them, is that a problem? It should be. And so years ago, when the country was willing to sacrifice, you gave up your sugar, your cheese, your meat, your salt, so on and so forth. Are Americans doing that anymore? That doesn't even enter in the equation here. And so, so what kind of a government do you really have? When you're borrowing yourself into oblivion. And so what you're seeing here is imperialism is the end game of American capitalism, is what you're seeing here. You're witnessing that as we go along here. Imperialism is the end game of American capitalism. Yeah. And while you're saying that, I'm thinking too, somebody mentioned it before, you mentioned it before, limited suffrage when the country's first formed. Well, fast forward to today. Who's the voter that really matters? The lobbyist, the privatized voter. That's the voter that really matters. He or she are the bag people that deliver those dollars for the manipulators of your government. I went to in fact, they had the League of Women Voters sponsored a gerrymandering discussion yesterday at Norwalk High School, and there were 3 speakers there. It was pretty good. It was pretty good, and it is an issue. In fact, there was a lady by the name of Checker, Cheker, and she's in her 3rd year at Yale Law School, and she's one of those involved in that the NAACP versus Merrill about the prison gerrymandering. And when they had a map showing that where the prisons have been built, and mainly in areas that are predominantly white, but then who's locked up in the prisons? Many of them are black and Latino, right? And that inflates the amount of people in a district, yet the prisoners can't vote. Right. And so interesting how that was. And I went up and talked to her at the end, and I said, it seems that what you're saying here is if you go back to the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution for the Southerners, And she just smiled and she just went. So yeah, it's interesting, these nuances here that change a situation. It's fascinating to see. It truly is. But then when you go back to, Sheas Rebellion, which occurs, as you mentioned, prior to the formation of the country, really just prior to it. And I find it interesting, you didn't have parties yet. You'll have the parties after the country's formed. Yeah. And then again, going back to citizen input here, I'm still a booster of that. I think the founders made a mistake. They didn't have those mechanisms in place in the Constitution which outlined how we pick nominees to represent us in government. Parties filled that void. And again, parties will do it for the sake of the party. I don't give a hoot and hell what any of these Democrats and Republicans say. Because without that, how long do you think those parties last? Let's be honest here. Besides the money. Going back to what I called the privatized voter, which is the lobbyist. I mean, how many people in Darien? 20,000? How many registered voters, approximately? A third, maybe? Let's say 7,000, maybe 8,000? 5,000? Okay, 5,000. Let's say you got a lobbyist who lives in Darien, can go down to Washington with $100,000 $100 bills. He voted 100,000 times. You only got one vote. You're done. So which voter is more important? The lobbyist. The lobbyist. Well, to a certain extent, there is some truth to that, but because the parties took control of the Electoral College. They picked the electors. And so when you read Hamilton in the Federalist, he reiterated the fact that, according to what's going to be the Constitution here, the states have to have the electors, but how the electors are chosen is up to the states. That's a sop to states' rights. But at the same time here, having said that, who picks the electors today, though? The parties. But Hamilton is alluding to the fact, how about having the voters pick the electors? To act as a check on themselves. That's an interesting concept. The voters picking the elect, because really, when the parties turn in, if a state wins, if Hillary Clinton won this state, the last election, the party has to turn in their election paperwork featuring Hillary Clinton and Tom Kean, who was VP. Also, the 7 people, the 7 electors, their names and addresses are on that form. So think about it. You're not voting just for Hillary and Kean. You're voting for the 7 electors, and you didn't pick them. Same thing would have applied if Trump and Pence had won the state. You would have had 7 different electors. So, interesting when you look at it from that perspective. Well, who the heck? You can find out who the electors are. That's public information if you go take a look for them. The parties can tell you that. If not, the Secretary of State can tell you that. Yeah. Well, in 1990, Congress passed that Chief Financial Officers Act, where every CFO of every major branch of the government was supposed to do an audit and turn it into Congress, since Congress, per the Constitution, has power of the purse. Well, guess who didn't do the audit for 28 years? Pentagon, right. And when they finally did the budget in 2000, and there were incremental steps leading up to this, but when they finally do the budget in 2018, representative from the Trump administration, well, we got the budget done, but we didn't think it would turn out that well anyway. And Ernst Young, the accounting firm, which is not a local accounting firm, by the way, they were one of those hired. And I read their little synopsis here that they say it's impossible to get to a result because of the way the Pentagon's been moving money around for years. And at the same time here, the Pentagon announced they can't properly explain spending $21 trillion. Now, if Congress passes this bill in 1990 and George Bush Sr. as president signs off on it, doesn't that make it law? Aren't you supposed to abide by this? Aren't you supposed to do, if you're a CFO, you're supposed to do that audit and turn it into Congress? One would think. Well, then what happened to the Constitution here? What happened to Congress as the caretaker of the purse? What happened to these building blocks of the early republic? She just went like this. Well, okay, checks and balances. What happened with that one? And so, so who has control of the purse? The people you elected to staff Congress, or the generals and industrialists that you don't elect? That's a legitimate question as far as me being a voter. Because I remember back in 2016 when I was up at Army Aviation Magazine, and then my boss says to me, well, are you ready for Trumpism? I said, belay that stuff, because at this time there was a question of $6.5 trillion from the Army. I said, why don't you talk to those 1, 2, 3, 4 stars you talk to periodically and ask them what happened to that $6.5 trillion? Maybe the new president will find that. Don't hold your breath there. But to me, I find this, as somebody that works on the fringe of this, I find that's an issue. I really do. I find that's an issue. Well, but then again, is some of that based on citizen participation? I mean, I don't care, some of these, well, socialism's terrible, so on and so forth. To me, it doesn't make any difference if it's a capitalist system, if it's a socialist system, if it's a, whatever system it is. If the citizen doesn't participate, the governmental structure goes down the tubes. Now you can make that argument if you want. Don't run for office. That won't get you elected. And next week is the Alien and Sedition Acts. Yeah, it gets better as we go along, huh?